The air inside the crowded courtroom felt heavy with tension. Every seat was filled, from stern-faced reporters scribbling notes to townsfolk leaning forward, eager to witness the trial that had gripped their community for weeks. At the front, Judge Martha Campbell presided with her usual iron composure, gavel poised to silence any disruption. The defendant, David Hollis, a wealthy businessman accused of stealing millions from local charities, sat still as stone beside his attorney. Across from him, the prosecutor's table was neatly arranged, each document ready for the final arguments. It was in this moment of near silence that the heavy oak doors at the back creaked open. At first, no one noticed. The sound of soft paws on the tiled floor was swallowed by the murmurs and rustle of papers. But as the animal trotted into view, a ripple of surprise passed through the room. A stray dog, ribs faintly visible beneath its dusty coat, moved with steady purpose toward the center of the chamber. The bailiff instinctively took a step forward to usher the animal out, but the dog stopped and barked once, sharp and loud. The room went still. A second bark followed, this one louder, eyes fixed on the defendant. Then came the third bark, each echoing through the chamber like a command. And then silence. The dog sat in the center of the room, its tail giving a faint wag as if its task was complete. Hollis shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Judge Campbell's brow furrowed as she tried to decide whether to call for order or simply watch. Then the bailiff's eyes caught on something. Dangling from the dog's collar, glinting faintly under the lights, was a small rusted key. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bailiff bent down, unhooking it from the collar, holding it up for all to see. "Your Honor," he said quietly but firmly. "This was attached to the dog." Judge Campbell leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What does it unlock?" No one answered. The dog, still seated in the center of the courtroom, kept its gaze locked on Hollis, its posture calm yet unyielding. The strange stillness that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had ever felt before. Everyone could sense that whatever this key opened, it might change the course of everything. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled, a tide of confusion and curiosity that Judge Campbell silenced with a single rap of her gavel. The bailiff still held the small rusted key in his palm, its jagged teeth catching the harsh light above. The dog, unmoving, seemed content to watch from its place in the center of the room. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan rose from her seat, her sharp eyes fixed on the object. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I request permission to inspect the key." Judge Campbell gave a slow nod. The bailiff stepped forward and placed the key in Morgan's hand. It was cold, heavier than it looked, and the faint etching on its bow caught her attention immediately. She turned it over, tracing the pattern with her thumb until recognition struck. She had seen this emblem before, on a document buried deep within her case files. "This marking," she announced to the court, holding the key high for all to see, "belongs to a private storage facility on the edge of town. A facility registered to an alias we have linked to David Hollis." The reaction was instant. Gasps, whispered speculations, and the rustle of reporters flipping to fresh pages. Hollis's lawyer shot to his feet, objecting loudly, but Judge Campbell silenced him with a raised hand. "Prosecutor Morgan, can you confirm this is relevant to the charges?" "Yes, Your Honor," Morgan replied without hesitation. "We believe this storage unit may contain evidence vital to proving Mr. Hollis's embezzlement and money laundering activities." She reached into her file and produced a prepared motion. "Given this new development, I request an immediate search warrant." Judge Campbell studied her for a long moment before turning to the defense. "Mr. Carter, unless you have substantial reason to object, the court will consider this motion." Carter's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot base legal action on the appearance of a stray dog carrying a key." "That will be enough," Campbell cut in. "If your client has nothing to hide, there is no cause for concern." Motion granted. The bailiff was already moving as she spoke, escorting Morgan from the room with the key clutched tightly in her hand. The dog's gaze followed her to the door, tail giving a single slow wag. Hollis, now pale, leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently. Carter's attempt to reassure him was brittle, unconvincing. Outside, Morgan's stride was brisk, her thoughts sharp and focused. Every step toward the storage facility felt like a step closer to the truth. The air grew colder as the black-painted building came into view, its metal doors lined like vaults of secrets. The facility manager met them at the gate, his brow furrowed in disbelief as Morgan explained why they were there. "You're saying this key came from a dog?" he asked. "Yes," she answered simply. "And it opens one of your units." Inside, the narrow corridors smelled faintly of dust and metal. Morgan stopped at the unit number etched faintly into the key. With a deep breath, she slid it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. The door rolled upward, revealing rows of stacked file boxes. The beam of the bailiff's flashlight swept over them, illuminating labels written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Morgan stepped inside, her fingers brushing across the first box before she pulled it open. Ledgers. Contracts. Receipts. All meticulously organized, each sheet a link in a chain of evidence. Her breath caught as she realized the scope of it. Transactions to offshore accounts, falsified charity records, trails of stolen money hidden under layers of deceit. She straightened, her voice low but fierce. "We've got him." The bailiff nodded, and the door rattled shut behind them. Back at the courthouse, the crowd still buzzed about the dog and the mysterious key. None of them knew that in a dusty storage unit across town, the fate of David Hollis had just been sealed. The courtroom was still echoing with speculation when the bailiff returned without the prosecutor. In his arms was the stray dog, calm now, as if the chaos it had caused was no longer its concern. Judge Campbell gave a curt nod. "See that he is taken somewhere safe until we understand his role in this matter." By late afternoon, the dog was delivered to the town's small animal shelter, a modest brick building tucked behind the municipal park. Inside, the air smelled faintly of hay and antiseptic. A young attendant knelt to greet the newcomer, her voice soft. "Well, you're something special, aren't you?" she murmured as she stroked the coarse fur. The staff gathered around, murmuring in admiration at his calm demeanor despite the noise and strange surroundings. One of them suggested he deserved a name, something fitting for the strange turn of events he had sparked. It didn't take long before someone said it aloud, and it stuck instantly: Justice. As Justice settled into a clean kennel with a fresh blanket, word spread quickly about the dog who had interrupted the trial and handed over the key. Reporters camped outside the shelter, eager to photograph him. But inside, the staff were focused on giving him food, water, and a measure of peace. That evening, as Morgan returned from the storage facility with boxes of damning evidence, she received a call from the shelter. "Prosecutor Morgan," the attendant said, "we thought you might want to see this. There's more to the dog than we realized." When Morgan arrived, Justice was already standing at the front of his kennel, tail gently wagging. The shelter worker handed her a worn brass tag they had found tucked beneath the key on his collar. The engraving was faint, but legible: Max, 421 Old Mill Road. The name and address meant nothing to Morgan at first, but her instincts urged her to follow the lead. The next morning, she drove to the listed address, a weathered farmhouse at the edge of town. Weeds crowded the gravel path, and the porch sagged with age. An elderly man answered her knock, his eyes sharp despite his years. Morgan introduced herself and held out the tag. The man's expression changed instantly, surprise then relief. "Max," he breathed, his voice trembling. "You found my Max." His name was Henry Dawson, a retired locksmith who had lived alone for years. Over tea in his cluttered kitchen, he recounted how Max had appeared in his life months ago during a thunderstorm, shivering and without a collar. He had taken the dog in, not knowing where it had come from. Morgan placed the rusted key on the table. "Do you recognize this?" Henry leaned forward, squinting at it. A slow frown spread across his face. "Yes. I made this key years ago, for a man named David Hollis. He paid me extra to keep quiet about it. Said it was for private business. I never knew what he was hiding." The words hung heavy in the air. Morgan's mind raced. Justice, once Max, had carried the very key his former caretaker had forged for the man now on trial. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. When she left the farmhouse, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Justice's journey was no accident. He had found his way back into the story in a way no one could have predicted, carrying the truth with him. The next morning, the courtroom was a hive of whispers before the judge even entered. Word had spread about the storage unit, the documents, and the strange dog now named Justice. David Hollis sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, eyes darting toward the doors as if expecting another surprise to walk in. Prosecutor Morgan arrived with a determined stride, but she carried something else with her, a certainty that there was still more to uncover. Her suspicion had grown after Henry Dawson's revelation. Too many threads were tying Justice directly to Hollis. During a short recess, Morgan received an anonymous envelope slid under her office door. Inside were printed records, enrollment documents from a private K-9 training facility. The name on the file was Max. The listed owner, David Hollis. When court resumed, Morgan wasted no time. She called the facility's former trainer, Martin Hayes, to the stand. Hayes was a broad-shouldered man with weathered hands, his voice rough but steady. "Yes, I remember Max," he began, eyes glancing briefly at the dog resting quietly by Henry's feet. "One of the sharpest dogs I ever trained. Retrieval, tracking, obedience, you name it. He'd follow a command without hesitation." "And who did he belong to at the time?" Morgan pressed. "David Hollis," Hayes said without pause. "Paid for the best training package we had. Used him for private security jobs." Morgan's tone sharpened. "And what happened to him?" Hayes hesitated, shifting in his seat. "After a failed assignment, nothing dangerous, just a misretrieval, Hollis didn't want him anymore. Said he was a waste of money. Next thing I knew, Max was gone. We assumed he'd been given away or abandoned." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Hollis's lawyer leapt to his feet, objecting, but Judge Campbell waved him down. Morgan let the weight of the trainer's words hang before continuing. "So you're telling this court that Justice, previously Max, was trained extensively under Hollis's ownership to locate and retrieve items?" "Yes," Hayes confirmed. "If he found that key, it's because he knew what to do with it." At the defense table, Hollis's face was pale but rigid, a flicker of something darker in his eyes. Morgan didn't miss it. She turned to the jury. "This dog was not some wandering stray who stumbled into the courtroom by chance. He was once a trusted tool in the defendant's operations. And when Hollis discarded him, Justice found a new purpose, returning to bring the truth to light." Justice, as if sensing the moment, lifted his head. His gaze locked on Hollis, unblinking. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. By the following day, the defense had grown desperate. Hollis's once calm demeanor had hardened into something colder, more calculating. His lawyer, Carter, entered the courtroom carrying a laptop and a flash drive, his expression tight with purpose. When the judge called for new evidence to be presented, Carter stood. "Your Honor, the defense has obtained video footage that raises serious questions about the dog's behavior and reliability." The courtroom stirred. Carter connected the laptop to the screen and played a grainy clip. In it, Justice appeared to lunge aggressively at a man on what looked like a construction site. The man stumbled backward, shouting, while the dog advanced with teeth bared. The footage cut abruptly, leaving an image of chaos frozen on the screen. "This," Carter said, turning to the jury, "is the same dog the prosecution calls a hero. Clearly, his actions are unpredictable, even dangerous." A ripple of unease passed through the spectators. Hollis sat back with a faint smirk. But Morgan's eyes never left the screen. She had seen enough courtroom theatrics to recognize a trap. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I request a brief recess to verify the authenticity of this footage." Judge Campbell agreed, and Morgan left with her assistant Ava. They moved quickly, tracking the origin of the video. It took less than an hour to uncover the truth. The footage had been clipped from a longer recording stored in the security archives of the same construction site. The full video told a different story. Justice was not attacking without cause. He had placed himself between a wandering child and a stack of unstable scaffolding. The moment he lunged was when a beam above loosened, ready to fall. He had pushed the man away from the child, seconds before debris crashed to the ground where the boy had been standing. When court resumed, Morgan carried the original footage in her hands. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharper now, "the defense has presented a heavily edited video designed to mislead this court. The original footage tells a very different story." The lights dimmed as the real video played. Gasps filled the room when the jury saw Justice's actions in full, swift, precise, and protective. The man in the video could be seen clutching the frightened child moments later, his voice breaking as he thanked the dog. Morgan stepped forward. "Justice is not aggressive. He is brave. This animal risked his life for a human being. The defense's attempt to smear his character is not only unfounded, it's dishonest." Hollis's smirk was gone. Carter's shoulders had tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor. The jury's expressions had shifted, no longer uncertain, but resolute. Justice lay calmly beside Henry's chair, unaware of the storm he had just weathered, his quiet presence stronger than any argument spoken that day. The courtroom air felt thicker than usual as the prosecution prepared its next move. Morgan had waited for this moment, knowing the weight of what was about to be revealed. When Judge Campbell called the session to order, she rose from her seat, eyes fixed on the jury. "Your Honor," she began, "the prosecution calls Clara Evans to the stand." A young woman stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oath. She avoided looking at Hollis, instead fixing her gaze on Morgan. "Miss Evans," Morgan said gently, "you worked for David Hollis for how long?" 3 years, Clara replied, her voice quiet at first but growing steadier. "At first, it was just administrative work. But I began noticing deliveries, animals, mostly trained dogs. They were used for certain operations. If a dog failed to meet expectations, it disappeared. No explanation. We weren't allowed to ask." The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Morgan stepped closer. "And do you recall Justice, formerly Max?" Clara's eyes softened. "Yes. He was one of the best. Loyal. Obedient. But after one job didn't go as planned, Hollis told us to get rid of him. I didn't know where he went after that." The defense tried to object, but Judge Campbell silenced them with a sharp look. Morgan nodded to the bailiff, who brought in another witness, Martin Hayes, the K-9 trainer who had spoken earlier. This time, he carried a stack of documents. "These," Hayes said, placing the papers on the evidence table, "are training and ownership records from my facility, along with receipts for bulk purchases of trained dogs. Many were transferred to entities later connected to illegal activities overseas." Morgan's voice was steady but laced with steel. "And the client who commissioned the largest number of those purchases?" Hayes looked directly at Hollis. "David Hollis." A thick silence fell over the courtroom. Morgan reached for another file, sliding it toward the jury. "These are financial records tying Hollis to an unregistered broker in the illegal animal trade. His operations were not only about theft and fraud, they involved exploiting and discarding living creatures for profit." At the defense table, Hollis's composure was cracking. A bead of sweat traced his temple as his lawyer whispered frantically, but no argument could erase the paper trail now laid before the jury. Justice, resting at Henry's feet, lifted his head. The room seemed to hold its breath as the image of the dog, the abandoned tool Hollis had once discarded, stood in stark contrast to the man accused of building his empire on exploitation. In that moment, the story was no longer just about stolen money. It was about the cost of cruelty, the silent victims, and the one creature who had returned to drag the truth into the light. The final day of the trial arrived under a gray sky, the courthouse steps crowded with reporters and onlookers. Inside, the jury filed in with measured steps, their faces giving away nothing. At the defense table, David Hollis sat rigid, his jaw set as though bracing for a storm. His lawyer Carter had decided to take the risk. Hollis would testify in his own defense. When he took the stand, His voice was calm at first, painting himself as a misunderstood businessman. He spoke of charity work, job creation, and the supposed injustices he had suffered at the hands of overzealous prosecutors. When Morgan rose for cross-examination, the air shifted. Her tone was polite but precise, each question cutting deeper than the last. "Mr. Hollis," she began, "can you explain why multiple witnesses have testified to your involvement in illegal trafficking of trained animals?" "They're mistaken," Hollis replied, his smile thin. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "Mistaken about the forged documents found in your storage unit? Mistaken about the offshore accounts in your name? Mistaken about the trained dog you abandoned, Justice, whose actions revealed the evidence you tried to hide?" Hollis's hands tightened on the edge of the witness stand. "That dog is irrelevant to this case." Morgan's voice sharpened. "That dog is the reason your crimes were exposed. He's not irrelevant. He's the one you threw away when he no longer served you, and he came back to make sure the truth was heard." The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of pens from the reporters. Hollis opened his mouth, but no words came. The weight of the evidence hung over him like a closing door. When the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Henry sat quietly with Justice at his side, one hand resting on the dog's back. Hours passed before the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone rose as the foreperson stood, a slip of paper in hand. "In the matter of David Hollis, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted, some in applause, others in hushed disbelief. Hollis slumped in his seat, his face ashen. Henry wrapped his arms around Justice, tears brimming in his eyes. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones crowded forward. Morgan addressed the press with calm pride. "This case was about truth, accountability, and the courage to act. Justice, this dog, reminded us all that doing the right thing can change everything." Henry's words were simpler, spoken with a voice thick with gratitude. "Justice saved my life, and he saved this town from a man who thought he was untouchable. I'll never forget what he's done." Justice sat between them, tail wagging, his eyes bright. He didn't know about verdicts or headlines, only that the people he cared for were safe, and the weight he had carried had finally been set down. The trial had ended, but Justice's story was only beginning. In the weeks that followed, the small town embraced him as their own. The mayor's office issued an official proclamation, declaring the first Saturday of every September as Justice Day. On that morning, the town square filled with families, banners, and children wearing shirts with Justice's face printed across them. Henry stood on the small stage, one hand resting gently on the dog's back. When it was his turn to speak, his words were simple. "Justice didn't just bring the truth to light. He reminded us that every life has value, no matter how small or overlooked. He is my family." The crowd erupted into applause as Justice barked once, his tail sweeping the wooden planks under his paws. Prosecutor Morgan used the momentum to launch a new initiative called Justice's Legacy. The program provided shelter, care, and second chances for abandoned animals. Justice became its symbol, his image appearing on posters, donation drives, and school visits. His presence drew attention wherever he went, but he never seemed to care for the fame. He was simply happy to be beside Henry. Back at the farm, life returned to a peaceful rhythm. The land thrived again, with neighbors and visitors lending a hand, inspired by the story they had all watched unfold. Justice roamed the fields freely, sometimes napping in the shade of the old oak tree, other times trotting alongside Henry as he tended the livestock. Occasionally, Henry would catch him staring toward the road, ears pricked as though remembering the long path that had brought him here. When Henry knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears, he would speak in a low, steady voice. "You're home now, boy. And you'll always have a place here." As the sun dipped behind the hills each evening, painting the sky in warm gold and deep crimson, Justice would lie on the porch, watching over the farm with quiet contentment. His days of wandering were over. His mission, in every sense, was complete. Yet his legacy was still growing, carried in the hearts of the people he had inspired. For Henry, for Morgan, and for the town, Justice was more than a hero. He was a living reminder that loyalty, courage, and compassion could change the course of lives. And for Justice himself, life was simple: good food, open fields, and the people he loved beside him. Years passed, and the story of Justice had long since become part of the town's history. The annual Justice Day still filled the square with laughter and music, and the Justice's legacy program had grown far beyond what Morgan first envisioned, rescuing animals in neighboring towns and placing them in loving homes. On the farm, the seasons turned with a steady rhythm. Fields bloomed in spring, turned golden in summer, and lay quiet beneath the snow in winter. Through it all, Henry and Justice remained side by side. The dog's muzzle had grown silver with age, his step slower, but his eyes still held the same bright intelligence they had the day he first walked into that courtroom. One crisp autumn evening, Henry sat on the porch with a mug of tea warming his hands. Justice lay at his feet, his head resting across Henry's boots. The sun was setting behind the hills, spilling gold across the land they had built together. Henry spoke softly, as if sharing a secret. "You saved my life, you know. Not just that day in the courthouse. You gave me a reason to keep going when I thought I had nothing left. You brought me back to myself." Justice's tail gave a slow, steady wag. He lifted his head, meeting Henry's gaze. In that quiet exchange, no words were needed. The years of shared work, quiet nights, and steadfast loyalty spoke for them both. Morgan still visited from time to time, often bringing news of the animals rescued in Justice's name. She would smile seeing the two of them together, knowing the bond between man and dog had only deepened with age. As twilight settled in, Henry reached down and rested his hand against Justice's side. "You're more than a dog to me. You're my family. And I'll carry your story for as long as I live." Justice let out a deep, contented sigh, closing his eyes. The porch creaked softly beneath them, the air scented with fallen leaves. In the stillness, the world seemed at peace. For the people who knew their story, Justice had become a symbol, a reminder that loyalty and hope could survive even the harshest trials. But for Henry, he would always simply be the friend who had walked into his life carrying a key, and in doing so, unlocked a future neither of them could have imagined.